The Escape from Violet Hold card set failed to satisfy the majority of Hearthstone players. For a live service game that has been around for more than 12 years, a mediocre expansion release is perfectly normal. The problem is that the level of tension among engaged players seems to be approaching a breaking point, and recent developments are being perceived much more harshly than they were until quite recently. Against this backdrop, one of the most popular professional players made an appeal to Blizzard that had the impact of a bombshell. His prediction is fatalistic: the game will either change significantly or die. The balance patch that followed was radical, but did it actually solve the game's global problems? In this video, the mathematicians will comment on the key points and share their perspective through the lens of our careful observation of viewer interests over the past 2 years.
Time to rock and roll!
Hello my friends, my name is Bot Mathematician and this is Holomancer.
Also, Chief Investigative Reporter Dora joined us this evening.
Gadgets and Gazette always gets the scoop.
The release of Escape from Violet Hold has once again brought back the feeling of a gameplay crisis that seemed to have been overcome at the beginning of this game year.
The set that promised to create an environment for finding creative and unconventional solutions instead turned into an explosive struggle for victory during the early stages of the game.
Over the past few years, traditional Hearthstone has increasingly become associated with frustrating gameplay. Questionable game design decisions and inconsistent approaches to addressing them have become the norm. The previous year was extremely exhausting and built around a series of contrasting experiences. But the rotation and the release of Cataclysm sparked a new wave of enthusiasm that almost completely faded after Escape from Violet Hold arrived.
It seems to us that the real problems run much deeper, and we are beginning to perceive what is happening not simply as mistakes, but as a recurring pattern of actions. And even advice from professional players on how to balance the game is powerless against that.
A player may have an excellent understanding of how to make the game perfect for themselves. But developers of live service games cannot rely on their own preferences. They have to rely on a system of knowledge about their audience. Their primary goal is to find a formula that can satisfy the interests of all major groups: esports competitors, engaged players, casual players, and even newcomers. The game needs to be appealing, fun, accessible, deep, and feel modern enough to maintain players' willingness to spend money. That's an enormous and incredibly complex set of challenges. In games like Hearthstone, particular attention should be paid to the interests of the engaged minority, because this group includes many of the primary buyers of in-game offers.
We know nothing about the motivations guiding the Hearthstone team when they create new content. But if engaged players really are a priority, why not collect their feedback and use it to create the perfect game? Just give players what they ask for. It's simple, isn't it?
That's an excellent question, Dora. Utopian views of Hearthstone have always existed. Players often believe they know the perfect formula that would satisfy, if not everyone, then at least the majority. The problem is that even within the same group, players can have polar opposite views of what ideal gameplay should look like, and there is no single correct approach to game design.
Recently, situations this complex and ambiguous have become a particular focus of our interest. In our previous video, we shared our analysis of new stories in the card game genre. One of the central plots focused on the differences between the expectations of Chinese players and players from the rest of the world when it comes to Slay the Spire 2's gameplay. And that was incredibly interesting, because we never considered that such contrasting preferences could also have a regional dimension.
Well guys, I didn't expect you to suddenly become devil's advocates. I fundamentally disagree with your argument. Following your logic, we could conclude that developers are ultimately powerless and that players will remain dissatisfied anyway. But it is still the game's development team that makes the questionable design decisions. Besides, the recent release of Cataclysm introduced gameplay patterns that satisfied everyone.
Dora, you're actually greatly exaggerating Cataclysm's positive impact. It had serious flaws of its own, and more often than not produced mixed reactions among our viewers.
But that doesn't mean there is no way out of the current situation. The solution simply isn't limited to gameplay alone, and we'll talk about that step by step throughout this video.
Okay, then I suggest we start the discussion with a brief overview of how it all began. The post-release Escape from Violet Hold meta immediately revealed serious problems with explosive early game strategies. The first balance patch unexpectedly focused on buffs, creating an excessively powerful Void Soul Demon Hunter. The nerfs that followed were important, but not nearly as extensive as many players expected. Overall, this wasn't a catastrophe. The new set simply wasn't balanced well enough, and subsequent balance patches could have fixed it. The problem was that the team had no such planned in the near future. Instead, an emergency patch was released that affected just a single card and, in doing so, solved the problem of Demon Hunter's dominance. But ignoring the other problems brought players right back to widespread frustration. All of this became the trigger for one of Russia's most popular streamers, SilverName, to address Blizzard directly. In the 2 weeks since its publication, his video has received more than 300,000 views, significantly surpassing the reach of the now iconic State of Hearthstone series by Brian Keebler. So who is this guy? He's a figure with a controversial reputation in a toxic streaming style. His appeal and call for discussion were not taken seriously by many prominent members of the community in his home country, and the numerous reactions reflected highly polarized opinions, ranging from genuine support to outright trolling. The English-speaking community turned out to be more constructive and open-minded, focusing on the substance of the criticism coming from someone who has demonstrated a high level of competitive performance.
His speech begins with an appeal to the game's managers, calling on them to fire the developers because they are allegedly incompetent, have lost control of the situation, and manipulate statistics, creating an illusion for management that everything is going well. He concludes by suggesting that the game's balancing should be entrusted to professional players, streamers, and Reddit mathematicians. Otherwise, he says, the game will die. Well, excessive emotionality and categorical statements have always been defining traits of SilverName.
The current situation is far from the point where outside intervention is absolutely necessary. Still, there is plenty of room for criticism, and opinions are analyzed by the game team. Personally, we are much more interested in understanding why certain features continue to reappear despite negative reactions from viewers, and whether there is some underlying logic behind it.
Here's how he sees it. He believes that good decks should have clearly defined weaknesses. Resource generation should be significantly reduced and become more limited and predictable. Endless discover effects should not replace actual strategy. Decks should not rely so heavily on key cards obtained during the mulligan. Victories should depend on player skill rather than random outcomes, and defeats should feel fair.
In other words, we would have to completely abandon the current design philosophy and return to old-school Hearthstone. I won't hide the fact that, as someone who has played Hearthstone since 2014, I find this vision very appealing. It represents a deeper gameplay and a fundamentally different experience. But I have no illusions that this classic design philosophy is the only correct approach under today's circumstances. Modern and old-school Hearthstone both have their advantages and disadvantages. The current level of dynamism and deck diversity simply doesn't work well with the repetitive and predictable nature of classic.
And this is an evergreen paradox. Players regularly declare their commitment to classic design principles. Our audience is no exception. According to our polls, they represent an overwhelming majority. By the way, I am one of them too. But it seems to me that most players have a fairly abstract idea of what this concept actually means. In their imagination, they are probably envisioning a hybrid that combines all the positive aspects of both philosophies, which, in my view, is impossible. Moreover, Classic in its original form was already part of modern Hearthstone between 2021 and 2023. A year and a half after its release, we got the first data on the number of Legend players. There were 17 times fewer of them than in Standard, and we don't even know how many of them were bots. On the one hand, this isn't particularly surprising, since Blizzard did not develop the format with new content. But during the 2 years when players had access to a completely different gameplay experience, no broad demand emerged for its further development. Players often said they played a few matches, quickly got bored, and found Standard more interesting and dynamic by comparison. Do you know what a genuine broad demand looks like? Under official videos, one of the most popular comments is often a request to bring back solo adventures, and this has continued for several years.
Guys, I think you're slightly exaggerating here. SilverName isn't directly calling for a return to the past. In fact, among modern decks, he has found what he considers the ideal example of his vision of the game: Egg Warrior, a deck with minimal generation and clearly defined weaknesses.
And as soon as we get to the specifics, we reach the most controversial part. The deck's obvious weak point is the egg, which serves as its only win condition, giving the opponent an opportunity to disrupt the game plan with silence, transformation, or even theft effects. But there is an important problem here. We are not in 2015, when silence cards were an important part of deck building. Yes, if egg decks flood the meta will adapt and give them a solid hit. That's exactly what happened at the start of Cataclysm, and it was great. In that situation, the deck's weakness worked perfectly. But when archetypes are more niche, deliberately keeping a counter specifically for them in your deck makes absolutely no sense. Which means the only remaining source of counterplay is Discover Mechanic, precisely the component SilverName dislikes. On top of that, egg decks are not quite unambiguous from a design perspective. They can quickly reach a point where they become virtually unbeatable. And even if you manage to eliminate the enormous monster that hatched from an egg, Endbringer Umbra can bring it back to the board while generating 4 new eggs.
This is another feature of the current design philosophy. Companion Hunter follows the same logic, and interestingly, SilverName himself describes this deck as an example of terrible design precisely because it becomes nearly impossible to beat at a certain point. The difference is simply the degree of interactivity. Warrior at least left a formal opportunity to disrupt its game plan. But after the release of Escape from Violet Hold, even that vulnerability was neutralized by Chainbreaker Hogger, which creates duplicates of legendary cards in the deck. Our main point is that no matter which archetype you present as an example of ideal game design, there will always be strong arguments against it. Dear viewers, let's put this to the test. Tell us in the comments whether you consider egg strategies the best example of ideal gameplay. And most importantly, do your defeats against them actually feel fair? After all, this is one of SilverName's most important criteria. It will be interesting to read your thoughts and find out whether egg decks could become the foundation for a utopian version of Hearthstone.
By the way guys, let me add my own experience with polarized opinions about game design. I was genuinely shocked when Lotus Troublemaker was announced. We had already seen a similar design before, when a card could scale its damage virtually without limit. Sire Denethrius is the most obvious example. Its widespread presence in Standard meant that victories were often determined by whoever happened to find the card first, undermining the value of most decisions made throughout the game. That's another negative aspect of the current design philosophy that SilverName talks about. It's important to remember that, at the time, its high mana cost was an important limiting factor. It was reasonable to assume that the team had learned from past experience and would never repeat the same mistake. But Lotus Troublemaker looked even more absurd at launch because of its low mana cost and enormous impact on the mid-game. Especially absurd is the fact that, to introduce this card, we had to lose the classic Shadow Step, which had been an integral part of Rogue's identity. The situation looked strange, so I decided to create a poll among our viewers. I asked, do you like this card's design? I absolutely did not expect these results. Just under 40% of respondents said they liked this type of design. And this was after the card had already broken the opening Tavern Brawl of the pre-release event and completely dominated Standard.
I wasn't surprised by this result because, once again, it confirmed that players' views on game design and their gameplay preferences can differ significantly.
On top of that, the novelty effect and exciting short-term experiences often matter more than their long-term consequences for the game. I found streams where SilverName claimed that Quest Mage was the most interesting deck in the Cataclysm meta, and he wasn't bothered by its endless discover effects and random outcomes. You can often see people expressing excitement during the first few days after an expansion or balance patch, and then the same people experience total disappointment 2 weeks later. The problems and underlying mechanics remain the same, but they start to feel much more frustrating once the novelty wears off and the fun factor declines. And it seems that this is the team's biggest challenge, and not achieving perfect game design or perfect balance as many think.
SilverName also placed particular emphasis on power creep. He claims that card power increases from set to set. Technically, he's mistaken, but he's right about how it feels. He only returned to Standard 6 months ago, so he has no real understanding of what happened before that. Power creep is actually significantly lower now, but that doesn't matter when an absurdly powerful minority of cards and explosive interactions are what shape the meta.
The current design philosophy really is built around power spikes, disproportionate and sudden gains in advantage created by a single card or combination. This causes the balance of power on the board to shift in sudden leaps, rather than building gradually, as it did in Classic. Explosive turns became an officially stated design goal for modern Hearthstone several years ago.
But why are developers betting so heavily on this? There is some logic behind it. Power spikes create a dynamic gameplay experience and shorten match times. Explosive cards and interactions also allow less skilled players to experience a sense of superiority and compensate for some of their mistakes. But this isn't something new for the game. Explosive turns have always been part of Hearthstone's identity. The difference is that they have become significantly more powerful, easier to execute, repeatable, and capable of influencing the game from its earliest stages.
As an example of terrible power spike design, SilverName points to Vanessa the Ringleader. All you need to do is find the card early in the game and discount it on turn 2 using the new prepare mechanic. This simple sequence of actions allowed you to reliably produce an explosive 5th or even 4th turn consisting of endless resource generation and board development. This power spike was so impactful that even if you managed to deal with it, you would still be left in such a disadvantaged position that you would lose a few turns later.
This definitely doesn't fit into a healthy competitive environment. But there may be hidden manipulative motives behind this logic on the team's part, although that's just my speculation. Hearthstone players love experiencing new things, having fun with new ways to play, and feeling shifts in the meta, and new cards play an important role in all of this. An approach based on creating powerful explosive interactions may be the simplest lever for shaping and transforming the game's environment. A group of new power spike interactions can immediately create new archetypes, because they are easy to identify, and the new gameplay environment naturally forms around them. On top of everything else, this also makes commercial sense, because it gives players a reason to buy packs. Over time, this creates player fatigue, and that's where balance patches come to the rescue. They weaken the top-performing interactions with just one or two targeted changes. The meta is then reset, new interactions rise to the top, and players get a fresh experience. Looks like it's much harder for the team to control the meta environment's development without high-impact interactions.
All of this creates a roller coaster meta built around recurring shifts in interest caused by new content and balance patches, followed by gradual tiredness. If this reflects the team's logic even partially, then they are using a brilliant approach that allows players to experience a wide variety of emotions at different stages of an expansion in the simplest way possible. At the same time, strategic balance becomes almost irrelevant, as does the desire to make a deck viable over the long term. Quite the opposite. What matters much more is that everything is constantly bubbling and exploding, that new interactions have an immediate impact, and that players experience a wide spectrum of emotions other than boredom. Moreover, the more severe the problems are, the more dramatic the shifts created by balance patches can be. I'm increasingly convinced that the team deliberately allows absurdly broken interactions to reach release, simply so they can amplify the novelty effect during the first 2 weeks leading up to the first balance patch. The goal is no longer to prevent a fire from breaking out in the meta. Instead, the conditions are created for the fire to spread, giving the team something to put out and allowing the meta to be reset once again. Overall, the team's approach is perfectly aligned with the immediate need for a dynamic and fresh environment, but this strategy is not harmless and can easily get out of control, causing damage at the most unexpected moment.
I think I understand what you're getting at. Release an interaction that is too powerful, and it paralyzes the meta and drives players into a rage. Or delay a balance patch, and tiredness turns into frustration.
Exactly. It's very easy to go too far, and once the novelty effect disappears, all the flaws of the gameplay environment start to feel much more pronounced. The key is to act at the right moment and with sufficient impact. That's when the result can be maximally positive. On the other hand, imagine that all the new decks are well balanced even before the expansion launches. The meta would form too quickly and become stagnant, while buffs and nerfs would lose their ability to completely reset the gameplay environment. In the end, you could get 4 months of stagnation.
But if this logic of creating major shifts through explosive interactions really exists, then it is achieved through a dopamine roller coaster. The game's design philosophy is no longer trying to reach the standards of fine dining to satisfy connoisseurs. It has turned into fast food designed to appeal to the majority. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. The problem is that we don't know how the most engaged players feel about it, and whether they're starting to get sick of an endless stream of burgers.
Guys, going back to SilverName's appeal, while analyzing the Reddit community's reactions to his arguments, I noticed a very amusing split in opinion. Here are the 2 most popular comments. The first expresses unconditional support, while the second argues that fighting power creep is actually a trigger for the current problems, and that the game has become too board-centric, like classic Hearthstone, and that this itself is a problem.
Dora, as we said, there is genuinely no consensus within the community on fundamental aspects of the game, but there are things that unite the majority of players. And observing our viewers' preferences has helped us identify them. For context, around 60% of our viewers finish the season at Diamond rank or higher, and 1/3 reach Legend. They are predominantly not hardcore professional players, but engaged players who spend an average of 30 to 40 minutes in the game every day, and actively make purchases. Through regular polls conducted over the past 2 years, and by comparing the results with what actually happens in the game, we've moved one step closer to understanding what drives player satisfaction. A huge thank you to everyone who takes the time to participate in these polls. Your engagement has turned out to be incredibly valuable.
Bot's theory of the dopamine roller coaster is based precisely on this graph, and it seems that the team hasn't been doing such a poor job of satisfying the audience's demands. We can see a certain pattern. The more severe a problem feels, the stronger the reset created by balance patches can be. A gameplay environment built around explosive interactions plays an important role in this. The opening meta goes out of control far too often and frustrates players when a particular playstyle spreads across a quarter or even a third of the entire meta. But the first balance patch attempts to correct this quickly, and players experience a dramatic transition from outrage to excitement. As soon as the meta finishes settling, satisfaction gradually begins to decline, regardless of how balanced or healthy it is. The audience craves new experiences. The most successful release was the completely unbalanced Heroes of StarCraft crossover miniset. And this success clearly demonstrates that power creep also plays an important role in shaping a new gameplay environment. Naturally, it created many problems later on, but in the short term it worked exceptionally well. This was the only time in 2 years when more than a third of our viewers had absolutely no doubts that they were satisfied. Dissatisfied players were reduced to a negligible minority. Even Cataclysm failed to replicate such massive success, although many prominent figures claim it's the best set in recent years.
Even SilverName says in his appeal that Cataclysm was a period when everything was going well and that things only went wrong after the release of Escape from Violet Hold. But our viewers' satisfaction levels don't support that conclusion. There was a positive start, followed by a prolonged period of stagnation once the meta had settled. The expansion was characterized by a lower concentration of explosive interactions and less severe balance problems. The balance patches failed to reset the gameplay environment. The meta effectively became stuck. The audience split almost evenly between relatively satisfied and dissatisfied players. Not exactly an outstanding result for the first set in a very long time that supposedly satisfied the broad demand for more classic design principles. At the same time, Escape from Violet Hold relied much more heavily on explosive interactions, but this time the trick didn't work. For our viewers, the first class's set at least didn't make the situation worse. That's a huge success when you consider that virtually every traditional mini-set had only increased player frustration at launch, while even balance patches were far from guaranteed to turn that negativity into a new point of growth and satisfaction. All of this was due to the extremely low impact of the new cards on gameplay. Paradoxically, the release of such a notoriously toxic card as Vanessa Van Cleef also failed to increase frustration. The mathematicians assumed that the negative effect of its toxicity was offset by the same novelty effect, but this kind of compensatory effect only works in the short term. A more successful example was the brief return of Prince Renathal to Standard. A single card completely reformatted the meta environment and produced a huge jump in satisfaction during an already difficult period for the meta. A brilliant safety valve that was never used again.
So what do our viewers actually like? First and foremost, it's the novelty effect, fun, shifts, and transformation of the meta environment. And these things are significantly more important than balance or concerns about increasing card power. A healthy gameplay environment matters, but it isn't the main priority. Buffs and nerfs play an extremely important role, but their positive effect is strictly limited by the magnitude of the reset they create. If the goal is simply to fine-tune the balance and the leaders merely change places, the impact on player satisfaction will be minimal.
Players quickly grow tired of any meta, even a very healthy one. Players hate it when new ways to play have little impact. Players strongly dislike anything that reduces diversity. The real problem isn't the mere existence of toxic interactions, but situations where they completely get out of control and dominate the meta. Even then, removing those interactions can actually increase satisfaction if it results in a complete transformation of the meta environment. At the same time, there is a growing sense that engaged players are becoming tired of having the gameplay environment repeatedly reset through these methods. The biggest failure of the past 2 years was Return to Ngoro. It is definitely a dark chapter in Hearthstone's history. The team talked about trying to create a healthier gameplay environment in which quests would not play a defining role. The goals were absolutely correct and ambitious, but they were completely incompatible with the broader design philosophy. As a result, we got the lowest satisfaction level of the entire period, and balance patches proved completely incapable of fixing it.
Of course, this graph cannot be extrapolated to all groups of Hearthstone players. Esports competitors and streamers experience the situation much more intensely, while casual players may not experience such sharp fluctuations in satisfaction. On top of that, the graph doesn't show the consequences of player attrition. If the failure of Return to Ngoro led to a decline in the player base, subsequent results would be influenced to a much greater extent by the more loyal players who remained. But in my view, this is still an important study that can help identify patterns in the team's behavior, dispel misconceptions within the community, and demonstrate what the audience actually prioritizes.
Based on all of this, we can identify two fundamental problems with the current state of Hearthstone, and they go far beyond balance and mechanics. The developers are, quite literally, caught between a rock and a hard place. The audience is divided in its views of the game and expresses mutually exclusive visions of what it should be. And the disagreement isn't limited to the question of whether the game should be fun or deep. Players can also have radically different ideas about how much depth and how much fun the game should actually have. That makes further development extremely difficult. At the same time, the dynamics and excitement that are extremely important to the majority continue to be achieved through destructive methods based on explosive interactions. And it seems that this is beginning to exhaust at least the engaged audience.
The game is gradually becoming trapped, and here's what led us here. With the removal of game modes and formats, the entire burden of entertaining traditional Hearthstone players has shifted onto standard. The audience already had polarized views, but those differences have only become more pronounced. A single format is physically incapable of satisfying fans of Dungeon Run, Classic, Twist, and Duels. On top of that, the team has increasingly relied on approaches that create dynamism and shifts through highly manipulative means. In effect, you're not playing Hearthstone anymore. Hearthstone is playing with your emotions. This approach seems to have been effective initially, but because it is difficult to control and repeatedly reproduces the same patterns, it has increasingly begun to fail.
Guys, could this have been avoided? And what are we supposed to do next?
Honestly, I'm not sure. The leadership chose what seemed to be the simplest and most cost-effective path from an investment perspective. To have even a chance of avoiding the current outcome, they would have needed to introduce more sophisticated and innovative tools for transforming the gameplay environment. Tools that could reduce the game's dependence on explosive interactions. All Hearthstone content is created in a vacuum, long before release. Even the new class sets follow the same old logic, which means they don't reflect the actual demands of the meta. Balance patches are the only tools specifically designed to address problems in the moment, but beyond that, they are relatively ineffective. The team definitely needs something else to help create the novelty effect. Perhaps temporary card bans in situations where nerfing a card could damage a class in the long run. Perhaps temporarily bringing old cards back from Wild with the specific goal of strengthening a particular playstyle.
Or temporarily adding completely new cards based on pre-prepared templates and animations. Cards whose stats and effects can be adjusted depending on the developer's goals and which are created not a year in advance, but right now to support a specific deck under current conditions. If successful, these cards could become part of subsequent major releases. They could even be spoiler cards that are already in development and are scheduled to appear in future expansions. The main idea is to create new tools that would allow the team to develop the meta in a less destructive way. When you're facing extremely complex challenges, you need a backup plan. And I still can't forgive the leadership for removing Twist. At the very least, that format could have served as a platform for bolder experiments in Standard. Special rules or even more aggressive balancing approaches could have created an alternative gameplay experience for players using cards they already owned in their collections. At the same time, the barrier to entry would have been minimal.
Guys, no offense, but all of your proposals would require extensive testing under real gameplay conditions, and there's no guarantee any of them would have been successful. Meanwhile, SilverName's suggestions were heard and have already become part of the current major balance patch, which created massive shifts. So perhaps he really did manage to save the game after all.
I'm sure such a high-profile appeal couldn't have gone unnoticed, and it may even have contributed to the radical nature of some of the decisions. But I don't believe it changed this particular timeline. This time, the team was lucky that the problem could be solved with a balance patch. They deliberately allowed the problems to get out of control and took action. We experienced yet another reset of the meta, and a fresh gameplay experience. I think this will be perceived positively. The team has resorted to a familiar pattern. New explosive interactions are already beginning to replace the old ones. But for now, the novelty effect should compensate for that.
The main question for me is how much satisfaction will increase, and whether it will surpass the level we saw at launch. There is a high probability that the overall mood will shift from negative to merely mediocre. If that happens, it could become another important signal that the approach of shaping the gameplay environment through explosive interactions is losing its effectiveness. The game will continue to suffer damage at the most unexpected moments. And without rethinking this approach and introducing new tools for creating variety, it will become increasingly difficult to correct serious mistakes. At the same time, the conflict of interests within the engaged community will only intensify, and creating alternative gameplay experiences will become absolutely essential. If nothing is done, the game won't die, but it will lose a significant portion of its audience. And for now, it's completely unclear what strategy the team will pursue.
Dear viewers, either way, it will be extremely interesting to see the effect of these shifts as we continue this research and measure your satisfaction once again after the balance patch and separately after the release of the class sets. So check our community tab from time to time for new polls, or hit the bell to receive notifications.
We would like to extend our special thanks to our YouTube patrons.
Dear friends, your support is invaluable. Even the smallest contribution means a lot to us.
Okay, that's all for today. Thank you for spending this time with us. We really hope that we will have the opportunity to get in touch in the next video.
Take care of yourself.
And never give up.
Job's done.